And I want to say this before we move on, and that is, I've noticed some people saying things like, well, you know, this seems vitriolic, or this seems unnecessarily divisive, or you know, it's offensive. Here's the thing: this thumbnail and title is not clickbait. People say, oh, it's clickbait. It's offensive clickbait. There is clickbait here. Should atheist YouTubers delete their channels? We're actually offering an argument for that. And so I want you to know that, yes, we're saying something that would have serious ramifications. We're not talking about cancel culture. We're not talking about your freedom of speech being squandered. We're talking about you intentionally or willfully removing your channel for these moral reasons that are being offered here.
Yes, my fellow apes, who I hope are well. You heard the man correctly. In this here video, I'll be defending the very existence of not only my channel, but indeed all channels who dare to earnestly question meek and mild Jesus, who loves us so much that he'll burn anyone forever for daring to recognize such things as the problem of evil and the endless contradictions in the Bible. Doesn't Jesus just bring out the best in people, huh? Apologetics Squared is a Christian channel that's dedicated to defending the alleged coherence of Christianity, and while I tend to disagree with their opinion, I personally really enjoy much of their content. Their videos are well presented, succinctly communicated, and above all, interesting. And talking of interesting, they recently published a very interesting video titled "Should Atheists Delete Their Channels?" Now, I obviously don't answer this in the affirmative. I mean, if I did, then I wouldn't be publishing this response, that's for sure. But I genuinely really appreciate the authenticity and originality of their reasoning, which is inspired by, and very similar to, Pascal's wager.
Now, let's start by looking at Pascal's wager. We're trying to maximize utility, which means we're trying to see which courses of action maximizes good for us.
Now, I'm sure that most of you are well aware of Pascal's wager, but as a quick recap, Pascal's wager is a pragmatic argument that's almost always presented through a decision matrix. The proponent of a god that threatens eternal consequences, such as Allah, typically represents the existence and non-existence of their god in columns, and belief and non-belief in their god in rows. They then emphasize that if their god doesn't exist, then you stand to gain or lose a finite amount of utility, depending on whether or not you believe their god exists. But, to the contrary, if their god does exist, then you stand to gain or lose an infinite amount of utility, depending again on whether or not you believe their god exists. Thus, they argue, the pragmatic choice, the rational choice, is to believe in their god even if the evidence overwhelmingly urges us not to.
So the action which is better for us is obviously to wager on Christianity.
Now, this finer point about evidence is often missed, and sometimes even by the proponents, and yet it is, by my lights at least, the most crucial and profound aspect of Pascal's reasoning. But I'll expand upon it a little later in relation to specifically Squared's argument. Anyhow, after presenting Pascal's wager, Squared acknowledges the primary objections, and then springboards from them to his own argument as to why atheists ought to delete their channels.
I actually think that those are valid criticisms of Pascal's wager, and I could totally understand why it may fail to push you to Christianity. However, it seems that Pascal's wager can stop an atheist from pulling people out of Christianity. Here's my thinking. How much utility does a Christian have on average? Well, it's a product of the probability that Christianity is true and the infinite reward they would get for being a Christian. Coolio. Now, if they deconvert, how much utility do they have now? Well, they do have some utility. I mean, they don't need to get up early on Sunday mornings or anything, but their utility is now merely finite. They lost that on average infinite utility that they previously had. So the transition from Christian to non-Christian has a net utility on average of negative infinity. So if a YouTube channel tends to cause deconversions, then it promotes negative infinite utility. If I knew my YouTube channel tended to cause people to be tortured for thousands of years, I would delete it right away. Thus, if a channel tends to cause deconversions, it should be wiped off the internet as soon as possible.
Alright, so let's reiterate Squared's argument to ensure that we're all on the same page. First, he reminds us that the expected utility of Christianity is the probability of Christianity being true multiplied by the value of the reward of believing that Christianity is true. Or as he put it to Dr. Liz Jackson and Braxton Hunter,
the way you get expected utility is like you multiply the probability that you'll get some reward or outcome times like the value of that outcome. So it's like the probability times the outcome.
And since the probability of Christianity being true is greater than 0, and the reward of heaven is infinite, it follows that the expected utility of believing that Christianity is true is infinite. Indeed, if Christianity is true, then the Christian stands to receive the infinite utility of heaven, whereas if Christianity is false, then the Christian stands to lose only finite utility. Now, of course, if this is our one and only life, then this finite utility means everything, and thus has enormous value. Without it, a Christian might live their entire lives repressing their sexual orientation, denying their psychological dispositions, alienating friends and family, being petrified of hell, abusing others because of their religious beliefs, or even rejecting life-saving blood transfusions, etc. I mean, Pascal himself rejected medical intervention primarily because of his Christian beliefs, boasting even that sickness is the natural state of Christians. However, all of this utility is still ultimately finite, and as Pascal expressed, in the presence of the infinite, the finite becomes a pure nothing. Hence, the atheist can only offer the Christian finite utility, and since there's a chance that Christianity and its eternal consequences are true, it follows, according to the expected utility hypothesis, that the atheist ought not to encourage Christians to question their faith, since if the atheist causes the Christian to drop their faith, and it turns out that Christianity is true, then the atheist will have cost that now ex-Christian an infinite amount of utility. And that's bad.
So if a YouTube channel tends to cause deconversions, then it promotes negative infinite utility. If I knew my YouTube channel tended to cause people to be tortured for thousands of years, I would delete it right away. Thus, if a channel tends to cause deconversions, it should be wiped off the internet as soon as possible.
Okay, so earlier I said that I'd later unpack what I consider to be the most crucial and profound aspect of Pascal's reasoning, and here's a good place to do this. I think it's fair to say that the average priest assigns a relatively high probability to Christianity being true, whereas I, for instance, assign a very, very low probability to Christianity being true. But I don't rule it out completely, since I consider it to be an unfalsifiable proposition, especially if we apply a metaphorical interpretation, which most Christians do.
And so when the question is asked whether I believe, let's say, that the resurrection of Christ is physical fact or symbolic metaphor, I don't know how to deal with that question.
Or to put this another way, and to just scratch the surface, I think it's extremely implausible that an all-powerful, all-loving God's good book would explicitly endorse such things as slavery and homophobia. This just strikes me as astronomically unlikely, but not impossible.
It's not that slavery was endorsed by the Bible, it's that slavery is universal among human civilization until modern times.
Likewise, I think that the chances that an all-loving, all-powerful God would create sentient beings through the insanely nasty and brutal process of natural selection is nearly inconceivable. But again, it's not impossible. There are some apologetic acrobatics that can be employed here. Or to give just one more example, I think that the likelihood of an all-loving God issuing an infinite punishment, hell, for a finite crime of not being convinced of a proposition is both infinitely immoral and, more to the point, pathetically unlikely. But it's not impossible. There are ways one can, and indeed do, defend against these objections.
Hell is a manifestation of the perfect justice of God.
Now, I don't find the defences convincing, but that's not the point. The point is that I'm not 100% certain that such a God doesn't exist. Hence, I must assign a minuscule but positive non-zero probability to Christianity being true. But since I assign a positive probability, Squared's conclusion follows. If I cause a Christian to drop their faith, then there is a chance, albeit extremely unlikely, that I will have cost that now ex-Christian an infinite amount of utility. And since all I can give them is finite utility, it does indeed follow that the rational and even moral imperative is for me to cease implicitly encouraging Christians to question their faith. That is, I ought to delete my channel. But luckily for non-Christians, and unluckily for Christians, I reject Squared's argument, and here's one of the reasons why. One of the most prominent objections to Pascal's wager is the many gods objection, which emphasises the crucial implicit or suppressed premise that somehow rules out all other gods that also threaten eternal consequences for insufficient praise and grovelling. Well, in the same vein, I offer to Squared's wager the Inquisition Objection. It's well known that when Galileo Galilei perpetually promoted the heliocentric theory of Nicholas Copernicus, the Inquisition of the Catholic Church conspired to have him sentenced to indefinite house arrest, with the trial finding him vehemently suspect of heresy. Now, we unfortunately need a quick side note here, as whenever I mention Galli's trial, a cascade of Christian contemptuous rage descends upon me, making out that Galli was severely punished for stating the truth, and that he was thrown in a cold rustic jail for his body to rot alongside his mind. But no, I didn't say that. What I said was that Galli was sentenced to indefinite house arrest for perpetually promoting the heliocentric model. And he was. Capiche? And even if no capiche, the objection I'm about to raise here still stands as a hypothetical. In Galli's time, the prevailing theological view was that the earth is the centre of the universe, as is supported by such verses as 1 Chronicles 16:30, Psalm 96:10, and Ecclesiastes 1:5. And so as far as the Inquisition was concerned, the heliocentric model is heresy, and thus belief in it, and certainly teaching off it, is against God. And what happens if you go against God? Eternal damnation, hell, or at the very least prevention from heaven, annihilationism baby, no angelic cupcakes for thou. Thus, in Pascalian terms, the Inquisition argued that Galli's earnest pursuit to understand and appreciate God's universe was corrupting the masses, and as such jeopardizing their place in heaven, their infinite utility. Famously, Galli retorted that, I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God that has endowed us with sense, reason, and intellect has intended for us to forego their use. And this is no doubt a sublime and inspiring sentiment, but in terms of Pascalian utility, it's silent. The God of Galli would never forsake his creatures for questioning whether the earth is the centre of the universe. But likewise, Galli's God would also never forsake his creatures for not questioning whether the earth is the centre of the universe. On this matter, Galli's God is indifferent, offering no utility either way. However, the Inquisition's God will forsake his creatures for questioning whether the earth is the centre of the universe, and thus we have an argument that matches the pragmatic prowess of Pascal's wager. The pragmatic choice, the rational choice, is to wager on the Inquisition's God, not Galli's. Now, this is so far an objection to Pascal's wager rather than Squared's, but it also has ramifications for the latter. Squared argues that the reason that atheists should try not to encourage Christians to reconsider their faith is because they can't offer the Christian infinite utility.
So Muslims trying to convert Christians, or vice versa, are just individuals who are trying to improve the chances of the other at getting infinite utility. The atheist, on the other hand, is just trying to tear down everyone's chances at infinite utility.
But in the Inquisition scenario, proponents of Galli's Christian God are equally handicapped, since they offer only the finite utility of having a more accurate model of the cosmos. So far as Galli's God is concerned, all Christians are going to heaven, but so far as the Inquisition's God is concerned, only Christians that accept biblical geocentrism are going to heaven. So, according to Squared's reasoning, Galli was horrendously immoral for trying to convince his fellow Christians of the heliocentric model. Indeed, if he convinced just one of them to doubt their views, then he was the cause of negative infinite utility, which is worse than all of the carnage of the Crusades. Well, damn, when you think about it that way, it's easy to see why they took him to trial. Fortunately, however, the Inquisition is long gone, and so too is the prevailing 17th century geocentric view of the Bible. But the objection here remains, and is easily applied to other theological beliefs. For instance, creationism. There's plenty of creationists that believe that teaching evolution jeopardizes one's place in heaven. Indeed, as far as many creationists are convinced, the infinite rewards of heaven and hell pivot on one's rejection of the mountains of evidence in favour of evolution by natural selection. And since Squared's God presumably doesn't threaten eternal consequences for belief in or rejection of creationism, Squared has a moral, mathematical imperative to never ever publicly cast doubt on creationism. For if he encourages a single creationist to reconsider their view, he will have caused them infinite negative utility. And what about teaching that Christianity is compatible with homosexuality, or that life doesn't start at conception? Many Christians don't take a firm stance on these, but since other Christians do, and indeed under the rubric of eternal consequences, none of us should challenge their biblical views, since we can only offer them finite utility. Yeah, this is getting pretty absurd, right? Or to put one last twist on it, What if an atheist God exists that will grant the kingdom of heaven only to her children that recognize that there simply is nowhere near sufficient reason to believe in her?
Liz talks about this, like maybe only atheists will like live forever in like this awesome, pleasurable afterlife because that's how the laws of physics are. That's really unlikely, but it's possible. And if an atheist did believe that, they should try to deconvert people from Christianity and Islam.
Yeah, it's possible. And because the reward is infinite, we have an expected utility that's infinite. As long as the chances are greater than zero, the atheist has an equal mathematical imperative to criticize views that obfuscate the way the universe actually is, such as, in my opinion, Christianity. And you know what? For what it's worth, I genuinely believe that the God that I just made up has a higher chance of existing than the God of Abraham.
So the idea is a deconversion, content that promotes deconversions, it gets people from the state of having like this infinite value, infinite expected value of being a Christian to not having that infinite expected value. So deconversions on average have like this net change of expected value of negative infinity. It changes people's expected utility by negative infinity. And that's like really bad. Like if I like somehow managed to torture you for 1,000 years, that would be like, you know, a bad thing to do, but that's not infinite. That's just like finite negative utility. So deconverting somebody seems to be like something really bad. So we should have like this moral obligation to not do it because of just how much utility it causes somebody to miss out on average.
Right on.
A second objection I'd like to levy at Squared's moral argument is, ironically enough, of a moral nature. To build up to this objection, let's talk about the negative utility of torturing someone for 1,000 years.
To put that in perspective, torturing someone for 1,000 years has a negative but finite utility. It doesn't even remotely compare to negative infinite utility.
Agreed, in the presence of the infinite, the finite becomes a pure nothing. 1,000 years is a pure nothing compared to the infinite. Or to go further, being tortured for a Google of years doesn't even remotely compare to the infinite. Squared is bang on the money here. But here's a thought. Would Squared, or indeed any Christian, try to stop me, at no risk to themselves, from torturing an innocent baby for 1,000 years? Would a Christian physically intervene on such depravity? I bloody well hope so. I would expect, demand even, that they do everything in their power to stop me from inflicting such massive negative utility. In fact, if a Christian didn't try to stop me, if they just stood idle as I tortured an innocent for 1,000 years, I'd argue that the Christian is also immoral, at least according to almost every moral framework I've ever encountered, with the principal exception being, ironically enough, divine command theory. But let's not get distracted. Now, if the Christian wishes to establish and maintain law that inhibits and punishes people for stealing and murdering, which they, and indeed we all do, then surely they'd wish to inhibit and punish people for torturing an innocent baby for 1,000 years. I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume that the typical Christian would intervene. However, it stands to reason that if the Christian would inhibit me from causing a finite negative utility to an innocent, then they would be infinitely more eager to inhibit me from causing an infinite amount of negative utility to an innocent. I mean, if they didn't, then this would be infinitely more ridiculous than telling me off for stealing a slice of cake, but being perfectly fine with me stealing the cake in its entirety. It would be completely inconsistent.
We're not talking about cancel culture. We're not talking about your freedom of speech being squandered. We're talking about you intentionally or willfully removing your channel for these moral reasons that are being offered here. Are we saying we should go around and do another crusade basically to stop YouTube atheism? That's not what we're saying here. That is not what we're doing.
But that is indeed what this moral argument entails. Christian Gulag camps. Look, if you won't inhibit me from causing infinite negative utility to the innocent, then you have no leg to stand upon to inhibit me from causing finite negative utility to the innocent. But you, and indeed we all, do maintain laws that inhibit and punish activity that causes, or even has the potential to cause, finite negative utility. For instance, it's illegal to own a nuclear bomb. To inhibit one from owning a nuclear bomb, which is capable of inflicting massive but finite negative utility, but to allow, with no issues whatsoever, one to walk around with the metaphorical nuclear bomb of earnestly questioning the Bible, which is capable of inflicting infinite negative utility, is just straight up inconsistent. Thus, Squared's argument not only entails censorship, but total annihilation. Further still, and here's where things get even more gruesome, given Squared's conclusion, it's not enough for me and other atheist content creators to delete our channels. If we've already been instrumental in someone's deconversion from Christianity, then, under Squared's analysis, we've already caused someone, and likely lots of people, infinite negative utility, which is necessarily worse than torturing an innocent baby for 1 trillion years. If Squared is ever to enact retribution on anyone for any finite crime, from theft to manslaughter to genocide, then consistency demands that he enacts retribution upon outspoken atheists with extravagant vengeance and furious anger, for we have already caused greater negative utility than all of the warlords of history. For making a YouTube channel, by exercising the sense, reason and intellect that he believes his God gave us. But putting morality aside, what am I saying here in terms of argumentation? In short, and as Liz expressed, this is a Moorian shift. The conclusion is so obviously contrary to what we know to be true. You know, that you shouldn't annihilate everyone who doesn't hold your worldview, that we know that the argument is flawed. In short, any moral argument that entails immoral consequences is obviously erroneous. Another objection that's often levied at Pascal's wager that also happens to have equal force on Squared's wager is that it's simply false that we should act to maximise expected utility, or at the very least it's false when considering the infinite. This objection was expressed by a few people in the comments, and was even briefly discussed by Squared, Liz and Braxton on Trinity Radio, though not nearly, at least in my opinion, to a sufficient degree. So let me expand upon it here. Suppose that we have 2 jars, each containing a googol of marbles, but the first has an even distribution of red and blue marbles, so a 1 in 2 of being red, whereas the other has all blue marbles apart from 1 red, so a 1 in a googol of being red. Now consider this wager. I'm going to pull out a marble from each jar at random, and if the marble is red, you'll either win a googol of years in heaven in the case of the first jar, which, remember, has a 50% chance of being red, or you'll win a googolplex amount of years in heaven in the case of the second jar, which, remember, has a near 0 chance of being red. Which would you wager on? Well, according to the expected utility hypothesis, the pragmatic and rational answer is definitely to wager on the second jar, which you have a near 0 chance of winning. But despite the expected utility being overwhelmingly in favour of the second jar, I for one would most certainly wager on the first jar, with a 50% probability of winning. And if you would too, then you, like me and many others, reject the very core of Pascal's wager. If it's simply false that we should act to maximise expected utility, then Pascal's wager and Squared's wager are neutralised from the get-go, since they are both predicated on maximising expected utility. Alright, let's wrap up. I have here offered just 3 responses to Squared's wager, but there are more, which, depending on whether or not there's a demand, I'm happy to additionally offer. In short, my Inquisition objection exposes 2 things. The first is that the argument can be applied to any theological position so long as the threat of eternal consequences is in the balance. And the second is that it can also be applied to any made-up position, so long as that position has a positive non-zero chance of being true and deals in eternal consequences. My Christian Gulag objection is a Moorian shift, emphasising that this moral argument entails such obviously immoral consequences that we know that the argument is flawed. And finally, the third objection I offered is that it's simply false that we should always act to maximise expected utility. Lastly, and this is technically another objection, I don't know about you, but I just find it so preposterously unlikely that an all-loving God would forsake a genuine ex-Christian simply because they found, by no fault of their own, a certain undercutting or rebutting defeater compelling. I mean, really? You think an all-loving God would do something so obviously immoral? Nah. But I guess it's possible. I mean, God works in mysterious and unfalsifiable ways. That's pretty much his superpower. Anyhow, as always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons who are implicit in the infinite negative utility that this channel inflicts on Christians. I humbly appreciate your help, because this evil work takes time and effort, I tell you.